ridding their land of game that might eat the crops. These laws destroyed an enormous share of the total agricultural produce. The secret history of classical political economy. Why has this aspect of primitive accumulation gone unnoticed for so long by so many students of classical political economy? True, the classical political economists generally maintain their silence regarding primitive accumulation when discussing matters of pure economic theory, although they were not absolutely consistent in this regard. Because of the novelty of their subject, these writers were not entirely in control of their own ideas. Specifically, I found that classical political economy openly expressed its dissatisfaction with the existing social division of labor quite clearly in diaries, letters, and more practical writings about contemporary affairs. This discovery led me to give a substantially new reading to the history of classical political economy. In their unguarded moments, the intuition of the classical political economists led them to express important insights of which they may have been only vaguely, if at all, aware. As a result, they let the idea of the social division of labor surface from time to time even in their more theoretical works. Typically, the subject of the social division of labor cropped up when they were acknowledging that the market seemed incapable of engaging the rural population fast enough to suit them, or more to the point, the people were resisting wage labor. As a result, much of this discussion touched on what we now call primitive accumulation. Although these slips flew in the face of the laissez-faire theories of their books, they add much to the value of classical political economy. Indeed, if classical political economy were nothing more than a conscious attempt to come to grips with and to justify the emerging forces of capitalism, it would have far less interest today. Just as a psychologist might detect an important revelation in a seemingly offhand remark of a patient, from time to time classical political economy discloses to us insights into its program that the classical political economists would not consciously welcome. These insights will reinforce the conclusions that we draw from their diaries, letters and more practical writings. This book is novel in four major respects. First, it addresses the question of what determines the social division of labor, the division of society into independent firms and industries from the perspective of classical political economy. Second, it develops the theoretical implications of primitive accumulation. Third, it offers a significantly different interpretation of classical political economy, demonstrating that this school of thought supported the process of primitive accumulation. Finally, it analyzes the role of primitive accumulation in the work of Karl Marx. All of these threads come together in helping us to understand how modern capitalism developed in the role of classical political economy in furthering this process. Dark Design's classical political economy is the product of a stormy period, distinguished by the emergence of capitalist social relations. Yet, the truly momentous changes of the time do not seem to appear in the great theoretical works of classical political economy. Indeed, these writers displayed little interest in conveying information about the great conflicts between capital and labor or between capital and the early pre-capitalist relations in the countryside. Nonetheless, these matters were of great importance to classical political economy. While we catch an occasional glimpse of primitive accumulation in the canonical works of classical political economy, for the most part we must read of the great conflicts of the time indirectly. Our tactic is to approach classical political economy, the way children learn to view a solar eclipse by punching a small hole in a piece of paper held above another piece. The dark design that appears on the lower paper is a shadow of the eclipse, albeit with some refraction. The classical political economists made this indirect approach necessary because they were generally successful in obscuring the role of primitive accumulation in their theoretical texts. Yet, When we turn to their letters, diaries and more policy-oriented works, the importance of primitive accumulation becomes far clearer. We can push our analogy of classical political economy and solar eclipses a bit farther. Both represent rare and fascinating events. People superstitiously interpreted solar eclipses as a sign of impending epochal changes. Similarly, the titans of political economy were thought to have been able to see over the heads of their contemporaries into the future. In this sense, their theories foreshadowed coming changes in the structure of society. Both phenomena, planetary configurations found millions of miles away and the social changes a century or more in the past, reflect important forces that still shape our lives. Specifically, the struggle against self-provisioning is not confined to the distant past. It continues to this day. See Perelman 1991b. In effect, we can look at the eclipse of pre-capitalist production relations in much the same fashion, with one major exception. In the case of solar eclipses, the brilliance of the source can destroy our vision. In the case of classical political economy, our vision suffers from the dimness. Revising classical political economy, our classical forebears may have been brilliant, but they were fallible human beings. They were certainly not wholly disinterested observers. Their theories were intended to advance their own interests or those of the groups with whom they identified. These interests colored their works, whether or not they realized this influence themselves. In the case of the struggle over primitive accumulation, these writers seem to have been intentionally obscure insofar as they could, lest they undermine their claim to generality for their theory. Consequently, the struggle against the self-provisioning of rural people cast only a light shadow across the pages of classical political economy, a shadow of an all but forgotten way of life, now obliterated by the process of primitive accumulation. This process has largely gone unnoticed among modern readers of classical political economy, in large part because the classical political economists attempted to prevent their readers from catching a glimpse of this process. Although we find ourselves reduced to studying the shadows of this struggle, the attempt is still worth the effort. Indeed, classical political economy conforms to a consistent pattern of almost always supporting positions that would work to harness small-scale agricultural producers to the interest of capital. This contradicts the commonly accepted theory that classical political economy offered its unconditional support for laissez-faire. I question the relative importance of the almost universally admired Adam Smith and make the case that Smith and the other classical authors attempted to promote the process of primitive accumulation. This reading suggests that classical political economy followed a different project, one that contradicts the standard interpretation of classical political economy. Before turning to the main body of this work, I wish to append a caveat about my imagery of the eclipse. By studying the shadows cast by the classics, we must keep in mind that such images have fewer dimensions than the object under study. One dimension that disappears from the perspective of classical political economy concerns the social relations between labor and capital. Writing from the comfortable heights of their elevated social position, the classical political economists interpreted working-class organization as mere disorder. Because of this insensitivity, a work, such as this one, is necessarily imbalanced. Much attention is given to the efforts of capital to control labor, but little is devoted to the reverse. I leave the reader with the responsibility of estimating the actual balance of forces as suffers from the dimness,